Season 4 of Notebook on Cities and Culture is brought to you by Daniel Murphy, Polar Inertia, a journal of nomadic and popular culture, online at polarinertia.com, and by Press Up, friendly web consultants who listen to your goals and provide solutions that make sense, online at pressupinc.com. We're sitting here in this pub, late morning, early afternoon in Toronto. This seems like a pleasant, very non-Niagara Falls type scene, doesn't it?
Yeah, it is. It's not that far from my house. We're about 5 minutes away from my house. I'm thankful to you for taking the subway out to meet me.
Such as it was.
Such as it was, with the infrastructure that's crumbling in this city in some ways. But we're a ways from sort of my hometown as I feel it when I write. But my fiancée and I live here now, and we're happy enough.
And it's a stark contrast to the city that makes the setting of Cataract City. I mean, I've never been to Niagara Falls, but it's not like this, is it?
No, I'd say this is a lot more cosmopolitan, a lot more... I would say there's a lot less. There's some blue collar, obviously, in Toronto, pockets of it, but Niagara Falls, as I've always seen it and as I've lived it, is a much more of a blue collar town and a factory town. But of course, you've got sort of the veneer, the overlay of the tourist. Sort of the tourist industry that ticks away. And so when people come there, they have the idea of it being the honeymoon capital of the world and Clifton Hill and the actual falls themselves. But what really sort of is bustling away beneath that, or below that, behind that maybe, is, it's just a lot of good, hard-working, blue-collar folks.
And it is here in the non-Niagara Falls city of Toronto. I'm coming to you from today. I never quite get that order right. From to today on Notebook on Cities and Culture. I'm Colin Marshall, speaking today with Craig Davidson, writer of novels, writer of short fiction, writer under several different names. As Craig Davidson, as himself, he has a new book out called Cataract City, preceded by books like Sarah Court, The Fighter, Rust and Bone. He's also known as the horror writer, Nick Cutter, and Patrick Lestewka. Is that right?
That is correct.
That's a hard one to get exactly right. Are you then attracted to desperate settings, per se?
I think that's a good question, Colin. I think like a lot of writers, I think I'd say that I'm always interested in the life that I never led. So I was grown solidly middle class. My mom was a nurse. My father was a banker. I never had to want, whereas my dad came up very, very blue collar, lower class. And I think he wanted, in a lot of ways, to provide for me and my brother in ways that his parents simply couldn't provide for him monetarily. They were very loving, but simply monetarily. So I think he went out of his way, him and my mother both, to kind of make sure that we never felt the suffering that he felt. And maybe in a strange way, that makes me, in sort of my fictional terrain, want to deal with characters in strife and suffering.
Because that is a kind of test, because you sort of know what you can do when faced with that, and when your parents lift you out of that because they want you to have a better life, you kind of long for the test, right?
I think that's very much it. I think maybe not only me, but maybe men and women of my generation, having not had those tests, or what they feel like are those tests, and not all of us, ones who have grown up in a certain way, maybe feel as though there's something that has been missed, or there's some inherent weakness in them that has never been addressed or has never been put to the test, or maybe it is a strength, but they've just never had it actually activated so that they could know for certainty. And certainly me writing books about it doesn't necessarily address it in any other way than sort of in a fictional sense. I'm not addressing it sort of head on, although I've made sure in some ways to make sure I've suffered privation in my own life and put myself to certain tests. But whether there's a deep interest in suffering or strife when I write, I think ultimately I like to have characters who go through things, and so who come out as changed and in sort of the metamorphosis of that is through trials that are of a physical and sometimes of a desperate nature.
And this is the Niagara Falls in Cataract City, a Niagara Falls of dog fighting, of bare-knuckle boxing, of dog racing, of cigarette smuggling, of knee smashing. I mean, the pursuits of this place, I mean, the most genteel pursuit in the book is factory work. I mean, that's the ceiling, right?
Right. I mean, I think one of the things that I worried about most with this book is because, I'm a son of Cataract City. I'm a son of Niagara Falls. I grew up in St. Catharines, which is about 20 minutes away, but functionally we call it the Golden Horseshoe. It's the same sort of 5 cities and towns in the same area that all kind of share a jurisdiction.
And are they all Canada? But Niagara Falls itself it's got the national border going through it. How does this work? What's American and what's Canadian? Or is it kind of a liminal state zone where no one really knows what they are?
Yeah, I think that's what the book kind of addresses, and I think that's where some people who have read the book find the fascination. It's not actually 2 realms. I find it's 3, because you've got the Canadian side, which again is very tacky and glitzy, but also has a backbone of really working class heart running through it, and you've got the American side, which is rough. It's a rough place. I feel like it's the great northern fringe of that empire, and in some ways it's kind of ignored. And then you've got right off to the side, really, but only a couple miles distance, the native reservation, which is its own kind of special realm and has its own laws and meanings. And so these 3 things, in terms of me writing about it, I mean, first of all, I don't have a choice. I feel like this is just the place that I feel most comfortable living in and writing about, and so it kind of came naturally. But it does fulfill all the things that are necessary for me to write about the things that I just find really fascinating about life.
It's a place where there's a lot of seething. The Niagara Falls, the Cataract City of the novel. I mean, there's the resentment between even 2 levels at the factory, management and labor. There's the resentment between friends that erupts periodically. You have 2 friends in the book, Duncan and Owen, who just, their relationship periodically shatters. It seems like things build up and it breaks for a while. There's the resentment between, as you say, the reservation is there. Between, I guess you'd say, First Nations in Canada. We just say Indians in America. Between them and here it's stark. I mean, it's just natives and whites, right? There's 2 races in this book, it seems like.
Yeah, I would say the one thing about Niagara Falls is it is a very, we're talking here in Toronto, which is a very multicultural city. I'd say Niagara Falls, the Canadian side, is very white bread. Very white. The American side is very black and very white. There's that tension if it exists.
That's the old American tension, black and white. Here's the old Canadian tension, yes. Red and white, as they say.
Exactly, yeah. I'd say there definitely is, and as you go more northern in Canada, you're going to run across deeper tensions where sort of that colonial instinct comes up against the First Nations sense of things and their land squabbles and these kind of things. But we're sort of talking about a more urban setting of... but those tensions are still absolutely as powerful, and probably in some ways even more powerful, because land up north, there's just miles and miles and miles of it. The closer you get to urban centers, that land, those borders become much more tight-packed, and there's the tension kind of gets stronger because of it.
There's a line that one character says in this book that seemed to me very telling. He's speaking to the sort of entrapment of a place like this. He says, other people research how to cure cancer. They make rockets or what have you. My people, what they do is they research what dog can best thrash another dog in a race or in a fight. What does that speak to about the way that you get a Cataract City tracks somebody into a sort of fairly low-level trap?
Yeah, I mean, I think, and these are the things that I was always concerned about while writing it, and this is probably answering your question, but probably taking a different tack on it as well, is that one of the things that I was worried about, because I am a Cataract City native, is, how are my old friends, not old friends, old is to say they're not anymore my friends, my childhood friends, and their families would receive this book, because I think it feels to me like a truthful telling of my sense of that place. But also I recognize it's fiction, and if I need things to be there, and if I need to have characters say certain things to sort of, I guess, accentuate the kind of themes that I'm wanting to work with, do I step outside of what the literal reality is? Well, yes, I do. So is, Cataract City necessarily, Niagara Falls, that area, necessarily a place of the profound despair that I sometimes picture in the book? I mean, yes and no, but you can find those same pockets of despair, those same people who feel like they are on a narrow track in Los Angeles where you come, or Toronto where I live now. So in that way, it's kind of universal. I feel like there are people everywhere in this world, whether they're living in a cosmopolitan area or a small town, that feel like they are railroaded in their lives, and that there's no hope for them to skip the tracks and move on to a life that better suits them.
Dealing with a universally low-placed segment of society. This segment is everywhere, not just Niagara Falls.
Yeah. Yes, I think that's maybe an important thing, that the longer I've talked about the book and kind of dwelled on it, I think as a writer you want to find universals and the ways that not only does this apply to the place geographically where you set the book, but hopefully it has some kind of resonance to people outside of it. But yes, I think very specific. Like, for example, I came from a middle-class family, and so I did have an opportunity. My parents insisted that I go to university, and that opened up a lot of opportunities for me that, say, the Duncan character in this book is based on my friend Matt from Niagara Falls, and his father worked at the Nabisco factory, which is now the Post factory. But anyway, it's a cookie factory.
It's still a going concern. This cookie factory, this baked good factory of some kind.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's still there. It will probably be there until the rest of the city crumbles around it, because it's the main source of income and for a lot of people there. And but if he wanted to, what happened with him basically was like, his parents were like, if you want to go to university or college, that's fine, but you've got to pay for it. And the best way to do it is once you graduate, go work at Nabisco. We can get you in there. And he just never... I think at some point those kind of opportunities felt like they dwindled away, and then he suddenly is working at the Nabisco factory, and that becomes sort of his life. So whereas mine, I had the opportunity to do something different. But when you look back at it, like, he is very happy right now. He has a family. He is deeply happy in a way that seems really genuine to him. And there's many days where I don't feel probably the happiness that he feels, or at least I assume so, right? So you say you had this opportunity, this person didn't have it. Well, in the end, it's about being happy with your life, and all the opportunities in the world don't necessarily ensure happiness.
Well, this reflects another type of resentment in real life, which is the kind of generational resentment happening in North America, especially right now. Like, hey, that guy a couple generations back started on the line at Nabisco, and he worked his way up to management, as a character does in this book. But there's the perception that that's not really possible anymore. And I think a lot of people our age in their 30s don't know whether to feel cheated out of something because of that,
Yeah. It's like, what's the whole born on third base and thought he hit a triple. And so whether you thought you hit a triple or not, if you're born on third base or second base, well, then you never have to actually potentially have that hit to get you to first, to get yourself to second. So it's a weird resentment to harbor, though, isn't it?
It's weird because we don't think about, like, there's certain generations, like one in this book, or even the generation of Duncan and Owen.
Yeah.
They think and this is hard to get my mind around. Maybe it was hard for you to get your mind around to write it, but that they would determine the course of their lives based on what factory was close to them. You know what I mean? Like, that's there. I guess I'll do that. That's kind of alien to us, right?
Yeah, I agree. It's certainly, and in a way, like, for me, when I grew up, the majority in St. Catharines, we had the GM plant. So it's the same. Like, Niagara Falls is the Nabisco plant. St. Catharines, 20 minutes away, is the GM plant. And it had the same magnet. It had the same magnetism. And I knew guys going through high school who they knew already. Their dad worked at the GM plant. They were going to go work at the GM plant. That was kind of going to be their... And I don't know... It almost seemed like they were actually cool with that. So, I mean, I think it's a mindset thing, too. Some people are really happy to find what they like to do, build a life around that. Others want to kind of explore, do all sorts of different things, and it just sometimes you're born in the wrong, possibility stream, I guess you would say. If you're the type who wants to settle down, and you're born with parents who are pushing you to do more than that, well, then you're going to be upset. Vice versa. So if you're on the other side of it, then of course you're going to be upset. These are sort of wonderful questions to kind of kick around. There's no answer to them, There's no answer to them, and it's
all good questions,
right? Yeah, exactly. And I completely agree. And they're the things that you sit and you dwell on, and you think about your own circumstances, and I think that's a wonderful thing about writing a book is you get to extrapolate circumstances that you weren't afforded, or you didn't have to suffer through, I guess, in some ways. Yeah.
And it gives you an opportunity for the kind of writer you are. I mean, I've mentioned before that you write under other names. It sounds like publisher mandated, maybe the audience won't like it if you're all writing all these books under one name. So you're also the horror writer Nick Cutter, but not making any... You're not tricking anybody with that. People know who... This is like a Nora Roberts, J.D. Robb thing. Like, people know who it is. But I wonder... There's a broader question that I'll get to, but first let me ask, do your horror readers cross over at all? Do you get a sense of if your readership is really divided along pseudonym lines?
I wouldn't have been able to say that with any clarity. The horror book as Nick Cutter just came out not even a year ago, so it's been kind of an emerging thing to trying to figure out where the readership is, what the crossover is. And I would actually say that I would have been surprised. First of all, it was, you nailed it. It was my agent and kind of the surrounding infrastructure who thought, listen, we got to have different names here because readers won't really respond. They'll be sort of confused almost, and I think that was not giving readers enough credit. But at the same point, I was fine to listen to the advice because I respect my agent a lot. But I think there's people who have discovered, obviously, through it doesn't take any kind of an internet search to discover that Nick Cutter and Craig Davidson are the same person. But if you're asking how many people have read the stuff under Nick Cutter or Patrick Lestewka, who has also read Craig Davidson, that's actually a smaller number. There does seem to be a divide there.
Which I don't want to talk to those guys, right?
Well, yeah, and it shocked me because... it shocked me only because maybe the type of reader I am, which you, as a human being, you sort of think that you are just representative of everybody. When it comes down to it, maybe you are actually a very small segment of a very small segment. And I loved reading horror and literary fiction together. But it seems like there is a greater schism there between people who will read, quote-unquote, in my case, literary fiction and horror fiction. But I think also, you're right, a lot of the elements of Cataract City or Rust and Bone or certainly Sarah Court or The Fighter are very, they're very visceral. They're very...
Right, that was the word I was going to use, in fact.
Right? Yeah.
I was thinking, what connects the literary works of Craig Davidson, the horror work of Nick Cutter? They're all novels of the visceral, in a way.
Yeah, I think very much so. And it's not like I... sit down and say, well, I'm putting on my Nick Cutter hat now and I'm writing under Nick Cutter, or, well, I better take this off and put on my Craig Davidson hat. It's all I could sit down and actually write as Nick Cutter during the morning and then edit as, some book I've done under my own name in the afternoon, and there's no shift or schism in my head. And I think anyone who reads, say, a couple pages of Cataract City and then reads a couple pages of the Troop, for example, will recognize, okay, this is the same person, and there's not... There are differences. I think I allow myself, obviously, to indulge in more fantastical flights of fancy as Nick Cutter. And, to be honest, it's somewhat easier to write as Nick Cutter, just because I think the burden of literary fiction carries a certain sense of making sure that every word counts, maybe more so than... But that just might be me. That might be my own inborn biases against genre and saying, well, it should be easier to write genre fiction than it is literary fiction. But I don't actually truly think that's the case, Right.
Well, there is a genre writer you've gone on record as quite admiring, Stephen King, whom everybody has read. I think there's very few people who have never read a Stephen King book. And I've often wondered what makes Stephen King books so much more effective than whoever is trying to clone Stephen King on their own computer. But I think there's something in common with his books and yours that's at a deep level. Stephen King's books are unsettling not because of the horror necessarily, to my mind, not because of the creepy stuff you see or the gross images or like the Stephen King is good with horrific images of horrific images of mutilation and killing, but also like horrific sexual stuff too. He doesn't get enough credit for that. But as well, it's not that. It's that he puts that stuff up against very, very detailed elements of poor or working class life, like the almost mildly desperate life. Do you agree about that as a Stephen King reader?
Yeah. I mean, I think too, the more Stephen King has gone on as a writer. I mean, there are certain writers who transcend genre, and he's written enough now, and he's written in so many different kind of avenues that's a book like or a novella like The Body, Stand By Me. It's not horror at that point. That is something that could have tripped off the pen of anybody, of any writer. I mean, any fabulously talented and introspective writer who understands human nature as well as he does.
From horror more often than you think.
Right, exactly, yeah, yeah, absolutely, and I think.
And he doesn't have to go under Craig Davidson to write that, right?
No, he's done it all. I mean, did Richard Bachman for a while, but
I like those books.
So do I. Yeah. I mean, I think he's one of the most keen chroniclers of childhood too that I've ever seen, of ever read of a writer who really understands the qualities of what it is to be a child, and which is amazing because I feel like Cataract City in the first part deals with being kids. And it's difficult to sort of pull your mind back to that point in your life where you were a child and you looked at things the way a child does, which is a totally different viewpoint, obviously. It sort of gets ripped out of you as adulthood kind of pulls it away in shreds. But I mean, I feel like, I mean, I did my master's of English, and I remember they went around the class the first day and asked, well, what's your favorite writer? I remember when I said Stephen King, there was just kind of this rippling of like, almost disgust of like, that? Not Pynchon, not DeLillo, not what? That? Him? Why?
There's a rebellious aspect to it, though.
I guess there's a rebellious aspect, and I think within the upper quarters of academia and whatever highborn literature you might want to aspire to or talk about, there's this sense of like, he's too prolific. I remember Harold Bloom wrote some screed against him. But I think true on the ground, boots on the ground, in terms of writers who are practicing right now writing, you will find a lot of love and respect and admiration for Stephen King and what he does and what he's brought to not just the genre, although that's been amazing, but just to writing in general and how much he's influenced so many of us, some of whom will cop to it, others won't.
Some of the disdain for Stephen King may come from the fact that his mission is a bit too clear up front. Like a book, you buy a book because you want to be scared by him, and probably will be. Most of his books, I think, effectively do that for a lot of people. And there's not, when you're writing literarily, it's not so, that's not really the program, is it, to really announce your intention?
I agree. I guess that's true. I mean, it's one of those things that you think about when you think about writing, and you put your head to it. What is the intention of a literary writer, or how do they announce their intentions, if at all? You're right, and it's much more circumspect generally as a literary writer. Whereas, you're right. Obviously, as Stephen King started that way. But as I already alluded to or said outright, so much of his stuff is really dealing with less. There's many books that don't scare you, and I don't even think he almost might feel like there's some intention of scaring you, but there's no need to. I mean, it can actually exist. Those books can exist without even the mild little shocks that they're trying to give you. Like, I'm trying to think of the one he recently did about the Kennedy assassination.
Yes. It was just named for the date of the assassination. In the U.S., I don't know.
Yes, same thing here, or the year. And there's the very small allusions to something pursuing him that might be, but ultimately that's just a strong book about character and so I think he has changed. But you're right. And sometimes, listen, there's the thing too, as a writer, as any kind of creative person, your history trails you. You can't divorce yourself from any of that. So, such as it is, yeah.
Right. Now, much of your writing as Craig Davidson has involved boxing. Cataract City does, and I can imagine that. I've heard you have a short story collection written as well in the world of Cataract City, and I'm sure boxing is not a part of it. What is the draw of boxing? Does it have to do with, as a writer, you have no more basic conflict than a boxing match?
Yeah, that's actually interesting, because it is something that I feel like I've probably finally moved on for. It's not like you might not find a boxing story out of me 10 years down the line, but I haven't actually dwelled on that specific kind of conflict in a while. But when I was first writing, I think you nailed it. I think you need, as a writer, vehicles to explain or kind of prove an entryway into the sort of motivations that you want to describe, the sort of themes and the sort of human context that you want to kind of, the terrain that you want to cover. And boxing always did do that. It was not only as the physical point of two men, two women, whatever it is, in the ring. It was everything that flowed backwards out of that, like a pond, a pebble dropped in a lake, and the ripples of, like, what is the mindset that you have to bring into that? What is the sort of monk-like observances that you have to kind of commit to in order to bring yourself to that moment? And really, what do you discover about yourself? I think that's mainly it. And I think a lot of my stories and novels come to that. It's that moment of, who am I? And you don't understand that. You don't come to the deep understanding of that unless you're put in that crucible of understanding. And sometimes it's physical, sometimes it's some other kind of decision that you're put up against. But mine was like, who are you as a person when the rubber hits the road? And what a better way could I get to that moment than through conflict?
And you don't learn about yourself, really, if you win all the time. I mean, I have a friend who told me about, actually a childhood friend that I've known since Duncan and Owen met each other, in fact, that same age, and he recently got into boxing. But we're 30 at this point. That's too old to start. But still, it's not about winning for him. I was talking to him about, he had to talk the coach into letting him in, because everyone else was 22, right? He wins sometimes, but it's better. And this is going to sound ridiculous because in the moment it's not good, but ultimately it's good to lose. It's good. A man does not often lose at a boxing match these days. You know what I mean? Just in life, there's not a lot of guys walking down the street who have got their ass beat.
Yeah, I think actually, if you'll indulge me in a bit of a story here, I'll tell you about my own experience with that. Because when my second book, The Fighter, came out here in Canada, my publicist called me up and he said, I think what we might want to do is have a boxing match, an actual you versus somebody. And I think he had assumed that I'd had any boxing training, and I hadn't really, in fact, I'd had really none at all. But I thought, well, listen, this is my job, and I should do it. So I agreed to it, and I was actually living down in Iowa at that point, going to school, and so they eventually put out a call to just the Canadian literary community, and my publicist called me up and said, we found an opponent. He's a poet. I thought, okay, yeah. I thought, okay, well, I mean, I went to school with some poets and good guys, but I wouldn't be worried about them, fighting in the ring. And so I flew up to Toronto to meet the guy, and he was just an enormous man, Michael Knox, and had some boxing experience, but big too, and just very serious, because you can't really. In the end, in a fight, you can't fake it. You got to get in there, and you've got to actually trade leather. So I went back to Iowa, and I had 2 months, and I'd already been training, but I really ramped up my training. And the way I'd always pictured it then, or the way I pictured it back then, was it's like a train crash that is coming in 2 months, and you've just got to have your train in as good of shape that it's not going to be totally derailed. Having met the guy, it was sort of a sense of I just got to get through this. It was
just his hugeness?
He was huge, but I wouldn't say he was mean, that's not the right, but he was very serious, and much, more physically skilled than I was, and had some background at it. And so the day came, and yeah, I got a beating. I took a beating in front of, 450 people. But, I landed some punches and I stayed up, and it was a 3-round amateur boxing match, like for real, no joke, and neither of us took it as a joke because you can't. And my father and brother came up, and afterwards, it's just this outlet of adrenaline, like the most massive adrenaline dump you've ever felt, and relief. And so we went out, there was a bar directly below the boxing club, and we just got drunk, like all of us. We just got hammered. And we were in a cab going back to the hotel, and my dad said, like, something along the lines of, I've never been more proud of you than I am today. And I'm like, Dad, I got the shit kicked out of me. And he's like, that doesn't matter. And in time, I've recognized that doesn't matter. You know what I mean? It just matters just being there, standing up. And in fact, in some ways, it's not. I'm not patting myself on the back, but to know you're going to get a beating for 2 months and but still realizing that I'm not going to fake a sickness, or I'm not going to pretend, I strained my hamstring, I can't do this, and just going in and taking your beating. And did I become a better man from it? I don't know. That's kind of a bigger question than I'm really ready to answer. But did it have an impact on my life? And do I feel like I can face certain things better having gone through that experience? And was it a silly promotional thing? Yeah, but whatever. You take your forward steps where you can find them.
And you did that twice, right? As memory serves, once in the U.S. as well. Was it also a learning experience to do it again, or was it just like, this again?
It was. I fought. God bless him. I fought Jonathan Ames, who was a wonderful guy and a tough bastard as well. And he beat me as well. He didn't beat me as bad, but he beat me. But I think it's the same thing. It's almost like riding a bike. Once you've done it once, you can continue to do it, so it wasn't as bad. And I wouldn't want to ever do it again. But I guess, like we talked before...
Do you still want to box in any way?
No. In fact, my buddy here, Matt Lennox, who is also a wonderful writer here, is gearing up for his first fight. Real amateur, I think 6-round fight, and he wanted like sparring partners. And I said, Matt, it's just not. It's not in me anymore. I'm too old. I had my go at it. I'll never forget it. But I don't need to throw myself back into. I've got a fiance now. We've got a 2-year-old. She doesn't need to see me coming home all busted up, or even knowing that I'm going to go out to do that. So no, I think there's certain things that unfortunately on your timeline you just have to kind of say that's enough of.
Right. And it's rare that a character in Cataract City in your novel will say that's enough. Especially the main characters, Owen and Duncan, are just enduring this constant stream of physical punishment, aren't they?
Yeah, they are. And I think, as I spoke about before, it's I don't know who said it, but action builds character. And so just let your characters experience stuff and go through stuff, and in my case, it's stuff of a physical nature and of kind of trying themselves. And Duncan, especially, of the two characters, the more blue-collar character, goes through a lot. A hell of a lot. But in a way, I don't know, I find like characters like that who just continue to suffer but keep getting up and keep... Because you only have one body. That's what you were given, and we go through life with it. And anything that absorbs, we have to live with it until the day that we shuffle off this mortal coil. So that kind of sacrifice and also in Duncan's case, in pursuit of something for himself, but really also for the people that he loves and cares about, feels like a noble ambition. And so yeah, he suffers a lot, but it's for something.
When I was talking to your fellow Torontonian novelist, Russell Smith, a while ago, he was saying he heard that 80% of fiction sold to women, and booksellers told him it's more like 90 in our experience. I take it you're writing for that other 10.
Yeah, I think, and Russell's very wise in that, and that's one thing that I was shocked. Again, as I spoke about before, you tend to think that your experience is the experience that would be prevalent, and then you realize, wait a sec, no, I'm a very small segment of a much larger kind of demographic. And I thought, well, why wouldn't all guys read the sort of stuff that I read? And when my first book, Rust and Bone, came out, it was a rude awakening that way of, no, there aren't a lot of men who read fiction. And why?
Those who do, they're not necessarily looking for the visceral.
Exactly. And that breaks down just by personality. But and women absolutely not. I found strangely women read a lot of horror, more so than I would have been aware of, initially. But in terms of like, you have your Chuck Palahniuks and a few writers of that ilk who are presenting what seems like a very male view of the world and seem to sell very well, but
it's like women are sort of barely in Chuck Palahniuk's universe in a lot of ways. He has a female following.
Oh, an enormous one, yeah, and I guess before you get into it, you feel like, well, okay, well, fine, that exists. Why can't But there's only so many spots at that particular dance. But then you run up against a notion of, well, two things. One, what else could I do? This is my view of the world. This is the way I see things. And if I were to sort of try and write something against my own grain, it would probably feel very fake, and it would be noticeable of this sense of like, this is not true writing. And there's a stubbornness in me too that says more or less the same thing that I just said, and like, well, this is what I have to offer, and if we can keep going with it. I think the one lucky thing with me, and I've noticed this, is that this is a weird dichotomy, but women don't read a lot of books, but a lot of male directors do.
Yes.
So you can find yourself your books falling into the hands of directors who have a sympathy or understanding for the world that you're presenting, and they can. So a book can get a second life, like Rust and Bone did with the film, and potentially maybe another book will. So I think my agent talks about it as like another bite of the apple, and sometimes you're not angling for another bite of the apple. You just write what you write, and whatever life it takes is what it takes. But sometimes you're right on the actual book-selling side of it. Very viscerally male books simply don't have the readership to sustain the numbers that some other books do.
I think back to what I know of the late 50s and early 60s and the sort of high-profile, glamorous boxing matches that went on, the stars of the sport. Here in 2014, we're sort of down to bare-knuckle fights between guys who, I'm trying to think of guys who someone who don't know them would call white trash versus natives who are also on the skids, pummeling the crap out of each other, probably killing each other in a lot of these cases. What happened to boxing?
Yeah, that's a good question. You'd say that MMA bit into that kind of a little bit, but I think the truth of the matter is, well, I don't know, I shouldn't say the truth of the matter is, because I don't know what the truth of the matter is, but I feel that society in ways just probably moved away from it, and whether that's a good or a bad thing is not really for me to talk about, but again, it's weird. Like, I have a lot of friends, and it eventually comes around to the idea, have you ever even been in a fight?
Everyone gets to that question sooner or later.
Yeah, sooner or later. Like, have you ever been in a fight? And to me, again, this was another thing that, like, yeah, I got in fights all the time when I was a kid. Not because I wanted to. I was the kid who got picked on and came to realize at some point, okay, if I fight this guy, even if he beats the crap out of me, which was almost always the case, they would leave me alone after that, because it's like, well, he's got that spunk at least that he's going to come at me, and there's got to be easier meat to be found. So, by the time I even got to these fights that we just finished talking about, I was used to getting in fights. I was used to losing fights. But there's a lot of guys in my generation who you pose that question to, and they're like, no, maybe wrestling matches with my brother or something, but I've never been in a knockdown, drag-out fight. And that's another thing that sort of shocked me, is that doesn't seem to exist. So, that being the case, what are you watching boxing for? Either the visceral thrill of engaging in something that you've never been in yourself, or you just see it as an antiquated, like, well, that's so silly. Why would people even do that anymore?
Yeah, there's that. There's a feeling that humanity, in some quarters, the feeling that humanity has transcended solving things with fists. Still with wars and whatnot, but on a man-to-man level, you're surprised to see fists come out. But in Cataract City, the city of the novel and the Niagara Falls of the novel, like, a big event of the book happens because a bunch of guys' dads just start Like, I'm not even really... It feels that it makes sense, but I'm not even sure I could explain, like, why the dads started fighting. Like, why in a place like Cataract City are they so quick to go to fists as a way to not even resolve problems, but just, what are they playing out there?
Well, I think in the scene you're talking about, it's kind of like class differences in the way that the one father has become, and that's one thing that I noticed having been a son of Cataract City and becoming a writer. And I think people have a sense of if you become a writer, your streets are paved with gold and money is falling from the sky and you're just catching it randomly and they think everything's wonderful. And you go home and there's a sense amongst my friends who I love dearly, but some who I don't hang out with anymore, is that you think you're better than us. And so, I mean, that's the thing of a small town, I think. And this might be a stereotype, but I've found it actually really personified in my own life, is that if you leave, you better not come back in better straits in any way, or perceive to be in better straits, because then you become better than us. And it's more like it's better we all...
You better be defeated.
Yeah, you better be defeated and you're coming back and you're going to be one of us and then you'll be accepted. But in my case, it's like first of all, I never felt like I was an enormous success at all. And I felt most comfortable there. And yet the strange sadness, I guess, is that you're perceived in some way as, well, you're better than us. You think you're better than us. You're looking down upon us, which is absolutely not the case at all. So it becomes tough to go home, and so I mean, that's sort of what played out in that scene that you're mentioning, is that this guy worked hard, went to college, basically got a better job at the same factory that they all worked at, and everybody who was still working down the line held resentment up against him for feeling that he was better than them, whereas his sense is like, I wanted something better for myself and for my family. Not to say that what you have is not good, but I just wanted something different. But that resentment kind of is what spurred. And you're right, yeah. Could they just have sat down and said, you know what, why I'm feeling upset is because I think that you think you're better than me. But that requires too much kind of like talking and working through the problem, whereas you just start flashing fists and it gets to the head a lot quicker.
It's true. And when you're fighting, when you're fist fighting, there is no class anymore. No class matters. Nothing like that, right?
Well, and in fact, usually in those cases, the lower class is actually at an advantage because they've come up a lot harder and they understand that kind of sense a lot more deeply. And if I were just a betting man in general, an upper class person versus a lower class person in a fight, you'd generally bet lower class.
I mean, by pure experience alone, they've probably had a few fights coming up, And these sons of Cataract City in the book, they are always talking about hardness, like what it means, why this place makes you hard, what it means to be hard. I wonder, do they think, when they look over at Toronto, do they think that those people are not coming up hard?
Well, they might, but the truth of the matter, like my fiancée is a social worker, so she goes into some very hard pockets of this city, and the hardness of those pockets might be more durable than whatever the pockets are in Niagara Falls. Not that that's ever going to be quantified in any way. I think any city has its rough pockets, but if they're looking across from Cataract City at like the spires of downtown, the gleaming skyscrapers where industry happens, then yeah, they would probably feel that way, and they would probably feel. I don't know. That's the good question, because as I said, you're always interested in the life that you didn't lead. So I don't know what that sentiment is, whether that's something to be aspired towards, whether that's something to be upset about, or kind of get your back up over. But also I know a lot of people in Cataract City who are very happy with their lives and very happy with their day-to-day existence. And I find that sometimes with the people in the big skyscrapers who make more money than God, they're as equally twisted up about in fact, maybe more so twisted up about the lives that they lead, and worried about the ways that they don't fulfill whatever it is that they thought that they were going to have when they were born.
Right. The concept of abstraction seems pretty important here. When you're working on a line, sorting out cookies or what have you, your labor is not very abstract. When you're in a tower in downtown Toronto in finance, you're more abstracted from what you're doing. And as we say, when you're boxing, maybe as boxing became less popular as a sport because it's not abstract enough. It's too non-abstract to conflict. Tennis is more abstract. That's more popular, but we somehow lost our taste for things that weren't at least a little bit abstract.
That's an interesting question, and it could very well be true. I puzzle over that myself.
I wonder if it's a question with literary fiction versus genre fiction. I mean, how do people use those labels? Genre fiction, things are less abstracted, right? Things are more real up front. The gross stuff, the action, it's happening in your face. The romance, it's right there. Literary fiction, we could almost define it as being sort of one level of abstraction up, right?
Yeah, and I think that's probably... I'm going to speak, personally, and maybe this is based on years of, doing a master's program and an MFA and maybe being too in... I become more a fan of because that's the way my own emotions are. They're actually very unnuanced. They're very straightforward. They're almost very black and white, you know what I mean? And when I feel something for my fiancé or my son or my father or my mother, there's not a lot of gray area there. And so I guess maybe when we were talking before about how it's easier to write genre sometimes, because you can present the way that you really feel in some ways without these enveloping layers of nuance and kind of like we're pulling back and kind of letting the reader, like, you can see what I'm saying here, right? You can understand, you can intuit where I'm going here, or and I don't know. It's very difficult to say. I love good literary writing when I read it, and I love restrained literary writing, but I think I'm not a restrained writer, as you probably noticed reading Cataract City, and I'm fine with that, and sometimes it makes me feel, to be honest, like a little dumb, because I can't find that nuanced kind of middle ground where I'm carving the inside corner. I'm kind of just flensing a little bit off the top, but I'm not really getting. I'm not saying what I really mean, and what I really want as a writer is this is what I really mean. You take it or leave it. And if you think I've overstepped the line, or if you think I've hit the nail too heavily on the head, well, fair enough. But that's actually the way that I really feel. That's the way that my emotions come to me, sort of in these big, fairly obvious, bursts. And I feel like a lot of literators feel it the same way, but then they feel like they have to peel things off of it to get to this kind of, I don't know, but whatever. They do it very, very well. So God bless them. Yeah.
In a book like Cataract City, you are combining, in a way, not spelling everything out, but also with, as we say, visceral scenes of visceral impact. So it's you're almost taking, I don't know if I would say taking genre materials and putting them into a literary structure, but certainly the events of the book would not be out of place in a book considered more genre, would they not? I mean, it's all a matter of how you put them together, right?
Totally. I think
it's not the actions, it's the arrangement.
No, and I mean, I think one of the funny things that happened was it got nominated for, I think it was the International Thriller Writers Award, and it's there with books by like George Pelecanos and very obviously thriller writers. And at first I think I was like, well, how did the book even find its way in that pile of books that were considered for that? But secondarily, why did it merit a nomination or a shortlist on it? But then you look at it, it's like very much. It's a book really told in 4 parts. One is sort of more, 2 parts are childhood, and 2 parts are more adult and crime-oriented, and kind of the repercussions of these 2 characters as they get, one of them falls afoul of the law and the other is kind of tasked with upholding it. And those are very genre kind of trappings. And as we've already spoken, you know my background and you know what I come from. So I think most writers are a synthesis of their own experiences and what they've read, their influences. And obviously I'm writing as Nick Cutter, and I feel like I've got a straightforwardly thriller book in me at some point too. So
take another pseudonym. You need a 4th one.
Depending if the agent decides one, then it'll just get too. I mean, I think at this point I would probably argue for just like, let's put it out on my own name. Can't we just understand that like a person has dualities and he or she has a lot of stuff in them? But yeah, no, you're totally right in that there's genre trappings to the book, and I certainly don't dispute it, nor would I want to run away from that.
It's one of those things I think about genre, because any subject matter can be can be written at any level. It's just never about the characters, never about the actions they take, always about how those are presented. And I think it makes me think of, we haven't mentioned this part about Cataract City, but it's very important. In the beginning, there is these kids, with their kids at the beginning, Owen and Duncan, they come together over professional wrestling, which many consider to be the lowest form of entertainment that exists. So tell me, were you ever a fan of wrestling as a kid?
Absolutely. I think that's really what the first part of the book is about, and that was the most enjoyable part of writing it, is that you get to go back to those times in your life when there were black hats and white hats, and everything made sense. The shades of gray sort of filch into your life as you get older, and you realize that everybody, your own parents included, are not perfect, and that the heroes that you grew up idolizing are actual human beings, and when the curtain closes, they go on with their life, and that life might not be the most pure of lives.
You abstract them as a kid the way that you sort of abstract everything, and when they meet their idol, a real wrestler, and it doesn't go well.
Right? Yeah, exactly. They sort of see the wrestler behind the curtain as he exists with all of his flaws, and the way that all of us are when we reach, say, 40 or 45. I mean, you've got, I don't know who said it, but every man at 50 years old has the face that he deserves, and most of us do. Myself will be included in that, and but if you're operating under assumption that this person is perfect, and this person is the person that you see in the ring, or whatever his area of excellence is, or her area of excellence is, then it's tough, I think, as a child to conceive that there is any part where that excellence fails.
Right.
And so when I grew up, wrestlers were the physical ideals. They did the right thing. And if they were bad to the bone. They were you could discount them as being just truly bad individuals.
Right, yes.
And you didn't realize that there was an entire circuitry, whatever existing behind them, that manipulated the way that we felt about it, and that manipulated the way that those matches went all the time. And you would even, I think as a kid, I would even actually, when the punches didn't land, obviously you would still say, you would find some way to discount that had even happened. Your mind sort of rewired itself to believe that, no, I didn't actually just see that. So, and that's
humans do in many contexts.
Oh, exactly. You're right. Even as adults, we do it. But I think the early part of the book is taken up with that kind of liminal stage, as you say, between childhood and adulthood, where they can still cling to the innocences of childhood and kind of the abandonment of saying, well, I don't have to deal with this because this is an adult problem. But there's a certain part where that starts to twist and bend, and you actually have to take on adult responsibilities, and the book thrusts those responsibilities on them at an early stage. But I'm fascinated by that kind of that tension, I guess, between when you can still be a kid, but when you have to sort of start understanding the way the adult world works.
Right. There's this moment when this wrestler, Bruiser Mahoney, has already sort of descended into his final drunken, psychotic paroxysms, where he wants to pull the scales from the eyes of these kids and say wrestling's fake. And on some level, I think Duncan and Owen already understand that it's fake. Every kid knows the things they like are at some level fake or presented to them in that way. But for every wrestling fan, I guess there's the wrestling's fake moment. But then there's the later moment. I mean, you grow up, if you reflect back upon wrestling, you realize that wrestling, on some level, it's fake, but on another one, wrestling isn't fake. It's really a theater of even richer human dramas. I mean, as you well know, you're right, these guys are wrestlers, something brought them to become professional wrestlers. They might be friends when they're supposed to be enemies in the ring, but the drama of wrestling is a very real drama, right?
Yeah, I completely, and I think that's the way it's managed to maintain some foothold in our culture for as long as it has. And it's it's a simple drama, and I think that's what is compelling about it. And I guess as we've gotten older, you've seen it become more sexualized, and they've tried to hold on to, say, my generation by sort of twisting things so that it kind of, but I think at its most purest, and the way it should ultimately stay, is just it's good guys and bad guys, and heels and baby faces, as it's said in the wrestling vernacular, and it presents a very clean, understandable view of the world. And now even wrestling has gotten to the point where it's acknowledging that, Stone Cold Steve Austin or whatever, you can be a bad guy, but still sort of be a hero in a way, which is fine. And every business is prone to the shifting cultural moment. Yeah, I mean, in the book especially, it was simply meant as as we said, a vehicle to express really that moment where you realize that the white hats and the black hats are actually all twisted together, all mushed up, and it's all just one kind of general patina of gray.
Yes, it is. I mean, and there's the drama at the level that it's dramatized in wrestling, but also the drama beneath it. More interesting, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and I remember once the internet came along, you'd start hearing stories that, Hacksaw Jim Duggan was doing coke with the Iron Sheik, and you're like, what? First of all, they're doing coke, but second of all, it's like the Avatar of America and the Avatar of like sort of the Middle East, who are supposed to be mortal enemies and they're buddies, sort of a thing, and and you hear this as a child, but as you said, I think there's some point of view that is, even as a child, is sophisticated enough and is kind of aware of the ambient signs around you, that it's not really, there is a curtain behind this and there's something twisting and roiling behind there that is the real basic nature of humanity, and it's not quite as clean cut as what this is being presented to you as.
It's true, and even in a book like Cataract City, where there are real visceral, to use the word again, boxing matches, dog fights, there's a whole wilderness survival novella embedded in there. These things are all on a surface level very compelling because it's life and death, it's blood and guts often, but it's really the sort of wider drama those things make up that is beneath them and around them. I mean, you care about the boxing match, you care more about why the boxing match happens, right? Yeah. I mean, the circumstances that compel those characters into that moment, and I think that's what we had to work on a lot in the editing of it, because sometimes the jury rigging around a book that maybe a reader isn't aware of is that whatever I tendered to my editor was not what the final product that ends up on the bookshelf. There's a lot of going back and forth with my agent and my editor, and mainly with Cataract City was like, okay, you have this set piece, this big fight. We have to make sure that the character's motivations going into it make sense, because otherwise it's just sort of like, oh, Craig, you're really good at writing these scenes, and clearly you've written yourself into one. And so you have to go back and they were there. The motivations were there. They just weren't as clearly stated as they needed to be. And that's really what it is. It's what funnels in any book, or movie or any kind of creative narrative. What funnels these characters to this point of calamity, and does it seem reasonable? Does it seem like, okay, I understand why this person found him or herself at that point in their lives, and can I empathize with that? And if I can't, can I at least understand it? And that's sort of the sort of mortaring and trowel work that needs to go on sometimes in the editorial stage to really get it to the point where you're hopefully the motivations match the actions. Now, finally, nothing in this novel really fits into the rural sort of winsomeness of Canlit, Canadian literature. What is essentially, if anything, Canadian about this book, or about the books you write under your own name?
Well, that's a great question, Colin. That's actually something that, because Canlit, and I guess this would be broadcast to people who are largely American, although anyone could listen to it. Obviously, anyone could listen to it. But Canlit is a very sort of special, but a nebulous and kind of a moving goalpost, because we as a country are young and we're evolving all the time. So, but what traditional Canlit was sort of Robertson Davies and Margaret Lawrence and that kind of notion of what Canada was, and wilderness narratives, and obviously as we go forward, Mordecai Richler and Monroe and Atwood, all of whom are sensational writers, and thank God that they happen upon the international stage to kind of open the door for the rest of us to come through to whatever degree that we can. But it's changing, right? And I think Canadian writers specifically are somewhat find ourselves hung up, because it's the way we come through university, it's the way we come up of like, what is Canlit? If we're going to write, what does it add to that kind of lineage of Canlit? But I think more and more we're realizing that Canlit is thankfully a mutable concept, and Canlit is whatever you're able to provide to it that kind of advances your own view of what your life has been in Canada. So, which would be probably no different than American literature, or the literature of any culture. But my stuff is very untraditional can lit. And did I worry about that? I'm the sort of person who worries about anything, you know. So yes, I worried about it. But I think, as we spoke about earlier, these are the tools that I have. This is what I bring to the game. If you're not loving what you're doing, you got to find a different job. You got to find something else that brings you joy, because writing is I don't know if curses are allowed, but it's a fucking tough gig, man. I'm not saying it's tougher than any other gig. It's not. I mean, there's
the Biscuit Factory is bad too.
Yeah, exactly. There are tons of rough gigs out there. But I mean, writing is the one where you feel like, listen, people are gonna come at you for critical reasons, and fair or not, whatever, you've got to tolerate them. But if you can't just sit down behind your computer and enjoy what you're doing and sort of disappear into the page and disappear into the story and those characters, whatever those characters are, whether they hit the hit the target of whatever canlit is or not. You just got to rate what feels true and valuable to you, and after that, just let sort of things shake out as they may.
Wise words in Toronto from Craig Davidson today, who's also known under other pseudonyms, most notably Nick Cutter, the horror writer, with more coming. I'm sure a thriller writer will emerge as well. Craig, thanks so much.
No, my pleasure, Colin. Thank you for having me.
This has been Notebook on Cities and Culture. I've been Colin Marshall. You can keep up with the cultural creators, internationalists, and observers of the urban scene on the show at colinmarshall.org. Thanks. Special thanks to everyone who backed Season 4 on Kickstarter, including Joel Neville Anderson, Daniel Levin Becker, Paige Calvert, Commander Manvark, Jonathan Crow, John Cunningham, David Dawes, James DeVito, Tim Dobbs, Paul Doyle, Jake Elliott, Kevin Emmett, Lawrence English, Jonathan Filbert, Andrew Philippone Jr., Michael Fransky, John French, Themistocles Eucrucius, Will Graham, Umberto Grant, Samuel Hansen, David Hayes, Jeff Hillenbrand, Mark Hines, Andrew Johnstone, Tadeusz Andrzej Kadlubowski, Peter Kavanagh, Ted Kane, Andy Cooney, Evan Landman, Alfred Lee, James Maloney, Sean McDonald, Alberto Bruzos Moro, Jason Miller, Rob Montz, Daniel Murphy, Richard Nash, Aidan Nullman, Patrick O'Flaherty, Danny Olson, Michael O'Regan, Ian Blosker, Christopher Porter, MJ Pritchett, Piers Rippey, Rob Schultz, Todd Shimoda, Cam Smith, Deborah Smith, Adam Sutherland, Maureen Kincaid Speller, Anna Traher, Thomas Interberger, Matt Warren, Nick Weigelt, Dion Wolf, Cynthia Yang, and Wayne Wright.